we'll get rolling. We both have a lot of players in this first tight end tier. Oh, wait, no, we don't. Nate, who is our standalone tier one tight end for anyone who may be new to fantasy football and is unfamiliar with this gentleman?
Oh, yeah. So Travis Kelce is the clear cut number one tight end with no one anywhere close to him. Well, even though we both agree he's tight end one, just to talk about him for a while, he scored more than 100 points more than any other tight end in PPR scoring last year. I will admit I was lower on him last year than most people. And there were a number of reasons why that ended up not being the case. One, he is on the older side for skill players. He's 33, going to be 34, which makes him the oldest running back or wide receiver or tight end that anyone will be considering in their fantasy drafts this year. So I was a little concerned about his age, and his play declined a little bit in 2021. That rebounded in a big way in 2022. The second highest receiving grade and offensive grade of his career, which makes him one of the best tight ends of all time, going to be a Hall of Fame tight end. Um, Even though I think he's the clear number one tight end, and why people will be drafting him in first rounds is even though he won't score as much as some wide receivers or running backs, it's just the gap between him and everyone else is so high. I am concerned a little bit about regression for him this year, particularly near the goal line when they were within 10 yards of scoring. He saw 19 targets, scored 8 touchdowns in those situations, and ran more routes than anyone else in those situations. And that's not just comparing him to tight ends in 2022, that's comparing him to every tight end season of the past 15 years. He was seeing significantly more routes, targets, receptions, touchdowns in those situations. So that's just bound to regress just because we've never seen anything like it. And it's unlikely they'll see that huge of opportunities again. Like Kelce has 4 of the top 10 seasons in most of those categories in general, but it was just so much further than anything we've seen from him or anyone else. So I do think we'll see a little bit of touchdown regression this year, but even if he regresses in terms of his quality of play a little bit, and he doesn't see as many touchdowns, that still places him as the top tight end by a decent margin from everyone else. The biggest concern would be if some of these young wide receivers start to step up as well, which would decrease some of that overall volume. But as long as that overall volume's there, it's so much more than every other tight end.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing, right? I mean, if it were any other position, I'd kind of feel like uncomfortable putting just one player in a tier of their own. I just think it's typically like a recipe for disappointment. But yeah, he's earned the right to be like kind of the one exception to the rule. Obviously, like you mentioned, that the risk there, obviously, as he's getting older, we just don't see a lot of 34-year-old receiving options continue to be elite, fantasy producers. There's probably going to be a drop off at some point. We thought it might be last year after 2021, but like you said, that rebound really was huge. So it's hard to bet on it too much, but it's going to come at some point, right? It's just, when is it going to happen? I still like him a lot this year. I mean, you just look at last season. Obviously, we know he's been like the overall tight end one in 6 of the past 7 years, something like that. So if you look at just last year with 11 top 5 finishes for the position, I mean, his lowest weekly finish was tight end 15. So you're just getting such a high floor already for him, and it just gives you such a positional advantage going Kelce. Typically, where I'm looking at him, usually around like the kind of the 107 mark is the earliest spot for me if I'm drafting in that range. So I do like a Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Cooper Kupp, Tyreek Hill, and then like Christian McCaffrey and Austin Eckler at running back ahead of him. But yeah, if he's falling further than that, that's usually where I typically would end up with Travis Kelce this year.
Yeah, I have him number 8 overall in PPR. I have him right around there, both half PPR and non PPR. It's something where if you have interesting scoring settings, it's definitely important to check that out. For example, the Scott Fish Bowl, which starts in less than a month from now in a number of ways. And that scoring system's one where he could be even more valuable than what we have him in normal PPR leagues. If you have any sort of tight end premium, that definitely bumps him up as well. Of just, if you don't have him, there's absolutely no way that you're going to find someone who can replace the kind of production that he puts out at that position.
Mm-hmm. For sure. So yeah, Kelsey stands alone in tier one, but how about tier two? Who are the guys that you put into that tier?
Sure. I start off with Mark Andrews at tight end two, TJ Hawkinson after being traded to the Vikings at tight end three, George Kittle at four after he finally scored a bunch of touchdowns last season. I have Kyle Pitts at five, Dallas Goedert at six, and Darren Waller at seven.
Nice. Yeah. So our first three are exactly the same. I have Andrews, Hawkinson, Kittle at 2, 3, 4. And then I have Dallas Goedert at five and Kyle Pitts at six. And I did push Darren Waller down a tier. So why don't we talk about the first discrepancy in our ranks here, which is Kyle Pitts versus Dallas Goedert. You have Pitts higher. I have Goddard one spot higher. What do you like about Kyle Pitts this year?
Drive Pitts higher. I got a Falcons jersey work done
Yeah.
right now. If you've only been listening to us, you haven't seen all the jerseys I've been wearing. But if you check out our YouTube channel, you'll see I've been wearing a different NFL jersey each week. This week, going with the Falcons to represent Kyle Pitts. With Pitts, I know he disappointed last year. The first thing that I know with him, he's still only 22 years old. If you look at any kind of age curves at tight end or look at tight end production in the past, it's really remarkable what he's done before this point in his career, even though we had so high expectations for him and he didn't reach those expectations last year. So I do think he's still improving as a player in general. With that in mind, he had the highest targets per route run last year among tight ends. 40% of his receptions went for over 15 yards, which was the second best for tight ends. He was leading the league in targets prior to his injury. If you look at intermediate and deep targets combined, it was really just he wasn't seeing those short targets that a lot of tight ends see. He was outside of the top 20 in those situations. So I really like him as a player still. It's only the offense that concerns most people, and me included. One thing is they were just too run heavy last season. So when they went to Desmond Ridder at quarterback, they started throwing the ball a little bit more, which makes me a little more optimistic that they'll start throwing the ball more often this season than they were last season. They also lost three of their top five wide receivers in free agency. They added Matt Collins, Scott Miller, Penny Hart, which none of those are really going to scare defenses. So even though he's still a tight end and not a wide receiver, I expect him to be used even more like a wide receiver next season than he was last season. He led all tight ends in targets when he lined up outside of the numbers last season, despite missing a number of games with injuries. So, like, we see arguments that tight ends are more like wide receivers, but we often think of them like the sort of like slot receivers. But he was being more like an outside receiver than we even see some slot receivers being. So, with the lack of depth at wide receiver, I could see him playing even more wide receiver this season. They added Jonnu Smith at tight end, so that can allow them to have potentially a lot of 13 personnel where they have two tight ends in line as blockers, and then that will allow Pitts to line up out wide, or they can move Pitts around so it could look like a passing formation or a rushing formation, which definitely puts them at a huge advantage. So for me with Pitts, a lot of it is the talent's clearly there. I think he has if anyone has the upside to reach Kelsey, I think Pitts is the player who can do it if they start targeting him or if they start just throwing the ball more and targeting him as much as they were last season. So obviously the drawback is that they don't have the quarterback that Kansas City has. So even if Pitts starts playing as well as Kelsey is, he probably still won't see the fantasy production that Kelsey's seeing. But I think Pitts is capable of getting there if Desmond Ridder can step up significantly as a quarterback.
Yeah, I like it. I'm with you. I'm still 100% a believer in Kyle Pitts. I know I'm not the only one, and I know there are plenty of people who claim to just kind of be out on him because of last year where he was hurt and he had poor quarterback play, which okay, I guess. I mean, but yeah, I'll for Pitts and Goddard, I'll alternate for sure depending on the draft. Really, this whole tier, I'm kind of alternating a little bit as I draft, but I do like each guy quite a bit. So depends on how I approach the draft. I'm not typically like a set strategy guy, but I've seen Pitts fall into the seventh round, and that's kind of an automatic grab for me there, especially if I haven't gone tight end yet. But yeah, you just look at his numbers from last year, like you said, everything that is there that the recipe for like an elite tight end. And the one thing, with all those targets, only 59% of his targets were actually deemed catchable by PFF, which ranked dead last among tight ends with at least 25 targets. So just a massive blow to like his potential production, and an area that we hope we'll see an improvement this season with Desmond Ridder under center, but not a guarantee by any means, obviously. Plus, they're still likely to be that kind of run heavy team, like you said, which is why I kind of have him at the bottom of tier two versus the middle or higher. But you're right. The upside is absolutely there if they start to be able to implement him more in the passing game, or implement more of a passing game, I should say, and then actually get him the ball so that he can make a catch on those plays. Because we do know that he is one of the better receiving tight ends in the league already so far in his short career. But as for Dallas Goedert, I know he missed 5 games last regular season, still saw about 6 targets per game, and that did continue into the playoffs last year, which if he's not in the lineup, the Eagles aren't really bothering to target the tight end position, but he is one of the better target earners at tight end in the league. And then what he can do with the ball in his hands is what really makes me like him a lot. Very similar to kind of AJ Brown last week when we talked about him. It's about a target quality plus like a bonus production potential once they get the ball. That makes me fall in love with these guys, because that yards after catch per reception, it does matter. It is one of the more stable metrics for tight ends year over year, and he's one of the best in the league in that regard. Last year he tied for first with 7.8 yards after the catch per reception, 6.8 the year before that, which was also a top 5 mark. So I like that quite a bit for him. Typically Goddard does tend to go after Pitts for the most part, from what I've seen. So again, that seventh round is usually where I'm getting the majority of my Goddard or Pitts, or the majority of my tight end shares, just whichever one of these tier 2 guys kind of falls into that range, which means I typically would have less exposure to like a Mark Andrews, Hawkinson, or Kittle. But I'm perfectly happy with a Goddard or Pitts in that range, because those other guys usually like third or fifth round, somewhere around there, I'd say.
Yeah, to me, this is like a clear-cut example of how risky do you want to be when drafting. Goddard feels incredibly safe pick. His fantasy points per game has slowly been increasing each season. His PFF grades clearly been elite in recent seasons. He finished second in receiving yards per game, which was second best for tight ends last year. And I expect that to continue. I think he's going to continue seeing plenty of yards. I think the big issue is he only saw 3 touchdowns. With how much they like running the ball near the goal line, I don't think Goddard's going to increase touchdowns all that much. I could see the receiving production maybe going down a little bit, just because they added more options in the run game as well as a little bit in the receiving game. Obviously, not a ton, but I think that could slightly decrease his volume, especially if they just start running more when they're up late in games. So, my problems with Goddard, nothing to do with the player whatsoever. It's just the situation with Philadelphia of there are so many good options in that offense, and they're going to be winning games, so they don't need to be throwing the ball late, and they don't like getting him a lot of touchdowns. So I think he's very safe. I think he's definitely going to be a top 7 fantasy tight end this year, as long as he doesn't get injured. And I think at the very least, he'll be top 7 in fantasy points per game at tight end, like he was last year and like he's been in recent seasons. I just have a harder time seeing him potentially being a top 3 or top 4 tight end, since I don't think he'll get the volume as some of the other tight ends in this tier. And I don't think he has the potential to get as many touchdowns as other tight ends in this tier, but he's definitely a fairly safe pick. And like if I'm drafting, if I don't get Travis Kelce, I definitely want one of these tight ends in this second tier.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Good call. Yeah. And then the one other discrepancy we had in these ranks within this tier, you had Darren Waller up here at tight end 7. I had him just one tier lower at tight end 9, but you're obviously higher on Waller this year. What makes you like Darren Waller heading to the New York Giants?
For me, a lot of it's the upside compared to some of the tight ends in tier three. Over the last 3 seasons, he's ranked second in receptions per game, targets per game, fourth in fantasy points per game, regardless of your scoring system. So he's been a very good tight end when he's been healthy. The problem is he hasn't been as healthy these past 2 seasons. A lot of those stats were helped by his 2020, where he had 17 fantasy points per game. Took a little bit step back in efficiency in 2021. And while he hasn't graded quite as well as he was at his peak, he's still been a top 10 receiving tight end by PFF grade. And the guys that we have ahead of him in PFF grade, but I don't have ahead of him in these rankings, Rob Gronkowski, who's retired, and then Pat Fryermuth and David Njoku. Both of them I have in tier three, but I just think Waller's opportunity with the Giants is so much higher, just because he should be the top option in this offense in the pass game. I think Kelsey and Mark Andrews are probably the only other clear cut top options that are tight ends on their team in terms of receiving. So I think volume will definitely be there in New York. They've had a history of throwing to tight ends. And if Waller is able to return to being the player that he was just 2, 3 years ago, then I think he has that potential to be a top three, top four fantasy tight end. And even if he's not, I think he'll be a pretty safe top 10 just because volume in this Giants offense, where I think other guys in tier three are safe to be right around the top 10, just don't have that upside to get into the top five, like I think someone like Waller has.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's fair, and I'm with you. I love the talent of Waller. Obviously, concerned about the constant health issues over the last couple seasons. Much of those, and then kind of how much of those injuries, that he probably plays through even when he is on the field, because we did seem to see some of his kind of after the catch numbers take a decent hit last year as well. He didn't force a single missed tackle. We saw that yak per reception drop to like 2.8 when it's never been below 4.2 in his career. So I do think he was dealing with more last season, and for a guy getting up there in football age, I should say, turning 31 this season, I definitely get it, especially as someone who still attempts to play football in his 30s. I do not recover the same way that I used to. I'm much more prone to aches and pains before, during, and after games. So, and that's in non-contact league. So I'm not blaming him. I do hope he bounces back this year. I definitely believe he can, which is why I have him in kind of that top 10 range as tight end 9. I guess I'm worried about maybe missing time. I do think, to finish higher, he's probably going to need to play close to all 17 games. I just worry that might be too much to expect from him at this point in his career, even on a new team with a fresh start. But I do like what you said. I think he is the favorite to lead the team in targets when he's on the field. I think it'll be fairly close, though. There's a couple other options there, but yeah, I still like the potential of Waller as a top 10 tight end.
Yeah, I think with the Giants wide receivers, though, like they have so many that can be rotating in and out that like trying to figure out who's going to be their starting three wide receivers, you could list 7 or 8 guys who have a realistic chance of being there. So, yeah, like I could see him leading in targets simply by being the player that's on the field and not rotating in and out, where I don't think they'll rotate their tight ends nearly as much with how much they have invested in Waller, where the wide receivers, it could be different guys every single week, basically.
For sure. Definitely.